a black adopted son, a missing will, and a family lawyer with a shadowy past. What they didn't know was that the old house still held secrets, and the truth was waiting to be heard. It was a golden afternoon in Savannah, Georgia, when 31-year-old Malik Chambers stood quietly outside the family lawyer's office, the funeral program of Celia Chambers, his adoptive mother, clutched tightly in his hand. She had raised him like her own, given him a name, a future, and a place to belong. Malik had come prepared to grieve, not to fight. But as he looked up at the polished brass plaque on the office door, a feeling crept in, not of closure, but of betrayal. What he didn't know then was that behind the sympathy and smiles, someone had already rewritten his place in the family and erased it completely. Malik Chambers was only 7 years old when tragedy rewrote the course of his life. After losing both birth parents in a sudden car accident, he was taken in by Celia Chambers, a retired schoolteacher known in Savannah for her quiet strength and deep compassion. She already had 2 biological children, Ethan, 2 years older than Malik, and Miranda, just a year younger. But she welcomed Malik into the family not as a charity case, but as her son. At least that's how she treated him. With Celia, love was an action, not just a word. She packed Malik's lunch with handwritten notes, read with him after school, and made sure his birthday was never forgotten. But while she opened her heart, not everyone in the house did. Ethan in particular never accepted Malik fully. He saw him as an outsider, an uninvited guest in the narrative of their perfect Southern family. Miranda was more neutral, friendly at times, distant at others, always following Ethan's lead. Malik felt it in the small ways, being left out of family photos, not having his name etched on the Christmas stockings, and hearing the word foster whispered by relatives during holidays. The Chambers family lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, a former Civil War-era post office-turned residence filled with creaky floors, hidden compartments, and a sense of history that hung in the air like dust. Malik spent years in those rooms, walking the line between son and stranger. He learned early how to make himself useful, mowing the lawn, fixing broken steps, helping Miranda with homework, quiet acts of devotion in a house where he often felt invisible. He didn't push boundaries, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he worked twice as hard to earn half the acknowledgement. But none of that changed the way Celia saw him. To her, Malik wasn't a placeholder. He was her son. And she made sure to remind him of that in countless quiet ways. Still, the family dynamic remained uneven. And as Malik grew older, so did the distance between him and his siblings. Ethan excelled in sports, Miranda in music, while Malik buried himself in books and stayed close to Celia. He never asked for much, not attention, not validation, just the chance to belong. And when Celia would gently speak of the future, of the will, of how everything would be divided equally among her 3 children, Malik believed her. Not because he needed the money, but because he needed that acknowledgement, that he had never just been passing through, that his place in the family was as real and permanent as the old bricks that held the house together. He had no idea then that others in that same house saw things very differently, or that their vision of family didn't include him at all. What he would soon discover was that even the strongest bonds can be rewritten, and sometimes the real inheritance is the truth buried beneath years of silence. The funeral was barely over when Malik, Ethan, and Miranda were summoned to the polished mahogany conference room of Wallace Crane, the family's longtime attorney and a man who had been a fixture in Celia Chambers' life for decades. The atmosphere in the room was sterile, quiet, too quiet, as if everyone already knew what was coming except Malik. Wallace, with his silver cufflinks and worn leather briefcase, opened the meeting with a solemn tone and a few lines about Celia's legacy, her kindness, her wisdom. Then, as if flipping a switch, he shifted to business. "Your mother updated her will just weeks before her passing," he said, sliding a freshly printed stack of papers across the table. Malik leaned forward, instinctively searching for his name, but it wasn't there, not even once. The house, the Victorian with its wraparound porch and storied history, was now divided between Ethan and Miranda. So were the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the jewelry, and the antique family heirlooms. "I'm sorry, Malik," Wallace said, his voice carefully measured. "Your name isn't included in the final distribution." The words landed with surgical precision, and for a moment the air left the room. Ethan folded his arms and leaned back with a faint smirk. Miranda avoided eye contact, studying her phone like it suddenly held the answers to life's questions. Malik sat still, his hands clasped in his lap, his face calm, but inside 1,000 memories rose at once. He could still hear his mother's voice, barely a month earlier, as they sat together on the front porch, sipping iced tea. "You don't have to worry, baby," she'd said, gently placing her hand on his. "I've made sure everything's taken care of. You, Ethan, and Miranda will each have your share. You're all my children." It wasn't a vague promise, it was deliberate, firm, spoken with the same quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of hardship and love. Malik had no reason to doubt her then, and he had no reason to doubt her now, which meant something was wrong. Very wrong. Wallace's explanation felt rehearsed, almost too smooth. "It was signed at her care facility," he added, as if to seal the conversation shut. But Malik knew his mother well. She was meticulous with her paperwork, clear about her intentions, and fiercely protective of fairness. She wouldn't have made a change like this without telling him, and she certainly wouldn't have erased him. Not after everything, not after the stories, the birthdays, the shared grief, and the whispered affirmations of love and belonging. Malik said nothing. He didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, and simply whispered to himself, "Something doesn't add up." Because while the others saw the meeting as the end, Malik quietly decided it was just the beginning. If someone had tried to rewrite his place in the family, they hadn't counted on one thing. He remembered everything. Malik left the lawyer's office without a word, his expression unreadable, but inside something had shifted. He didn't argue, he didn't make a scene. He simply walked away, not out of acceptance, but out of clarity. That night, he returned to the old family home, now shrouded in silence, every creaking floorboard echoing with memories. The house hadn't been touched since Celia's passing. Dust clung to the picture frames, her favorite mug still sat by the kitchen sink. But Malik's steps carried him toward the library, her favorite room, the one she'd asked him to rewire just a month before her death. She'd said it was to fix the faulty outlet behind her desk, but in hindsight, her request had been oddly specific. As he removed the panel, a small glint caught his eye. Tucked deep inside the wall was a tiny black device, a hidden voice recorder, its indicator light long dead, but its memory intact. With trembling fingers, he charged it and pressed play. A faint crackle, then her voice, thin but unmistakable. "Wallace," she said firmly, "I want the will divided evenly among my 3 children. Don't interfere. If anything happens, this recording is proof I never changed my mind." Malik froze. It wasn't just a moment of sentiment, it was evidence, clear, intentional, and time-stamped 6 days before her passing. That was enough to make him question everything. Why hadn't this been mentioned? Why did Wallace seem so sure? Fueled by a growing sense of betrayal, Malik began digging, not just through family files, but through public court records. What he found stopped him cold. 2 decades earlier, Wallace Crane had been quietly investigated in a forgery case involving disputed property documents. The plaintiff? An elderly widow claiming he had altered legal paperwork behind her back. The case was quietly settled out of court, and all mentions were buried, likely thanks to Wallace's deep connections and long-standing reputation in Savannah's legal circles. It was never publicized, never followed up. But the pattern was there. Malik realized this wasn't just a fluke. Wallace had done something like this before, and he was likely doing it again. The realization was more than personal now. It was systemic. This wasn't just about Malik's place in a will, it was about justice, truth, and the weaponization of trust. The pieces began to fall into place, the timing of the will update, Wallace's overly smooth delivery, Ethan's smug silence. Malik felt the sting not just of exclusion, but of orchestration. He wasn't just forgotten, he had been erased, deliberately. And now he held something Wallace didn't know existed, his mother's voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it was firm, unshakable, and undeniable. Malik didn't yet know what his next step would be, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let her voice be silenced. Not this time, not by anyone. Determined to follow the truth wherever it led, Malik returned once more to the library, this time not as a grieving son, but as a man on a mission. The room, with its old oak shelves and scent of aging paper, felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a vault. He began searching methodically, every drawer, every crevice, until his fingers grazed the edge of a canvas that didn't sit flush against the wall. Behind the painting of a magnolia tree, his mother's favorite, was a small, recessed safe, hidden neatly within the wall. The keypad was old, but Malik knew his mother well. She had once told him her childhood phone number, and when he entered it, the safe clicked open. Inside, preserved in a sealed plastic folder, was the original will. Handwritten, dated, signed in her elegant cursive, and notarized by a local official. It clearly named Malik, Ethan, and Miranda as equal heirs. It was concise, airtight, and indisputable. What Wallace had read at the meeting was not just a different version, it was a complete fabrication. Malik copied every page, photographed every detail, and then took the entire file to his private attorney. He made no threats, no public accusations. Instead, the next morning, he walked quietly into Wallace Crane's office, placed a USB drive and a printed copy of the authentic will on the desk, and simply said, "You have a chance to make this right before someone else does." Wallace paled, but said nothing. Hours later, Malik filed an official complaint with the Savannah Police Department and submitted all evidence of will tampering. But what happened next turned suspicion into scandal. In the course of the investigation, authorities reviewed Wallace's financial activity and discovered a suspicious transfer. $80,000 had been moved from Celia Chambers' estate trust to Ethan's personal bank account just 3 days before her death. The signature authorizing the transfer matched Wallace's own. It wasn't just ethical misconduct, it was felony fraud, and suddenly the story made front-page news. Malik's calm had paid off. With patience, precision, and the power of truth, he had uncovered a conspiracy not just to steal from him, but to rewrite the legacy of the woman who had loved him most. Wallace was now under criminal investigation, and Ethan's involvement implicated him in financial collusion. As the charges mounted, the balance of power in the Chambers family shifted. For the first time in his life, Malik wasn't being questioned. He was being believed. And it hadn't taken shouting or violence, just facts, just his mother's own words, her handwriting, and the quiet but devastating realization that the truth, once found, cannot be buried again. He didn't need vengeance. What he wanted was for her voice to be louder than their lies. Now, finally, it was. The courtroom was packed the day the verdict came down, the air tense with anticipation and the weight of unfinished truths. Malik sat quietly near the front, not as a victim, not even as an accuser, but as a son honoring a promise. The judge's voice rang clear as the original handwritten will was formally reinstated, and Wallace Crane was indicted on 3 felony counts: document forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of estate funds. The once respected attorney who had stood behind polished desks and smiled behind polished lies now looked hollow, his legacy crumbling under the evidence Malik had so patiently uncovered. Ethan, whose smirk once filled Malik with silent rage, was stripped of his claim to the inheritance and called to testify under oath about the money wired into his account. Miranda, visibly shaken by the revelation of the forgery, made a choice few expected. She took the stand, confirmed the will's legitimacy, and publicly apologized to Malik through tears. Her words didn't fix the past, but they cracked open a space for something that had never existed between them: respect. And Malik? He didn't seek revenge. When reporters asked how it felt to win, he simply said, "I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to protect what my mother believed in." Fairness. He turned down interviews, refused to capitalize on the media attention, and walked away from court not with a triumphant grin, but with quiet resolve. The inheritance, once a symbol of conflict, became something else entirely in his hands. With his share, Malik established the Celia Fund for Truth, a non-profit legal resource center dedicated to helping foster youth, adoptees, and marginalized children navigate guardianship disputes and family court systems. The center offered pro bono legal aid, advocacy training, and emotional support. tools Malik wished he had when he was younger. Located in a modest brick building on the east side of Savannah, the fund quickly became a beacon for those too often silenced or overlooked. Malik staffed it with passionate young attorneys, many of whom came from backgrounds not unlike his own, and mentored law students who wanted to use their degrees for justice instead of power. He never put his name on the building, only his mother's. "She gave me a voice," he once said to a volunteer, "so I'll spend the rest of my life making sure no one else's gets stolen." For Malik, redemption didn't come in the form of punishment. It came through purpose. He didn't need to see Wallace go to prison to feel whole. What mattered was that the truth was restored, that Celia's wishes were honored, and that the lie that had tried to erase him was now a cautionary tale. In a system where people like him were often sidelined, he had made space for himself and for others. The story that began with a stolen name ended with a legacy of integrity, one that didn't scream for attention but worked quietly, fiercely in the background. Because Malik understood now that justice isn't just about one courtroom victory. It's about making sure no one else has to fight the same battle alone. Months later, the waiting room of the Celia Fund for Truth was quiet, except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional shuffle of papers. A young black boy, no older than 12, sat nervously on a worn chair near the front desk, clutching a manila folder filled with legal documents. His guardian, it turned out, had forged a signature to claim an inheritance left by the boy's late aunt. He didn't fully understand what had been taken from him, only that something was wrong and no one else had listened. Until now, Malik Chambers, now in his early 30s and the founder of the center, stepped out from his office with calm authority and knelt beside the boy. He smiled, not out of pity, but out of recognition of the fear, the confusion, the weight of being told you didn't belong where you know you do. "You're not too late," Malik said softly. "You're right on time to take back what's yours." The boy blinked, then slowly nodded. He hadn't come here hoping for a miracle. He had come hoping for someone to believe him. And Malik did, because he had once been that boy, sitting alone, holding on to a voice no one else wanted to hear. But now Malik's voice carried the weight of truth, of law, and of the woman who taught him that dignity wasn't given, it was claimed. The center's walls were lined not with plaques or trophies, but with framed photographs of children the fund had helped. Some reunited with lost property, others with lost family, all with a new sense of agency. Every time Malik walked past those faces, he was reminded that legacy isn't built from what we inherit, but from what we refuse to let be erased. Justice is not something we are handed. It is something we must rise and fight for, with evidence, with patience, and with the unshakable belief that truth doesn't need to be believed in to be real. It only needs to be found. In a world that often rewards the loudest voices and the most powerful names, true strength lies not in domination, but in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to be written out of their own stories. Malik's journey wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. He didn't need validation from the family who once ignored him. What he needed, and what he ultimately created, was a space where others could stand, speak, and be seen. The lesson he carried forward wasn't printed in law books or found in court rulings. It was something his mother had once told him while folding laundry on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The truth doesn't shout, baby, it waits. And when the right person listens, it echoes. That echo now lived in Malik's work, in the children he served, and in the silence he broke. For those who came to the center, afraid and unheard, he offered not just legal help, but dignity. He had become what he once needed, someone who didn't just hear the truth, but chose to act on it. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that no matter how powerful the lie, the truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced again. Thank you for watching this powerful story of truth, justice, and resilience. Malik's journey is a reminder that even when the odds are stacked against us, standing up for what's right can rewrite not just our own destiny, but the future of others. In a world where silence can erase lives, one voice backed by truth can make all the difference. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about the quiet battles people fight behind closed doors, then imagine how many more stories like this deserve to be heard. At X Daily Stories, we bring you real, raw, and unforgettable narratives that highlight courage, redemption, and the power of doing what's right, even when it's not easy. Don't miss out on our next story, because the next twist might be even more powerful. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. New stories drop every week, and trust us, you'll want to be here when they do. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that truth doesn't need permission. It just needs a voice. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and keep listening.